A peaceful vacation quickly turns into a nightmare when a black family is stopped by a rude cop in a small town. Little does he know, they're not just any family. They have the power to expose his prejudice. What happens next will change everything. Can their quiet strength make a difference? Before we dive into this powerful story, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss more inspiring and thought-provoking videos like this one. Your support helps us share impactful stories that matter. Now, let's get started. The sun was just beginning to rise as the Williams family loaded their car, filled with excitement and anticipation. After months of planning and saving, this vacation was more than just a break. It was a well-earned escape from their hectic daily lives. For the past few weeks, they had worked tirelessly, pushing through the grind to make this moment happen. Now they were heading to a peaceful beach town, far away from the demands of work and school. Marie Williams, the mother, glanced at her husband, James, as they both secured the last of their bags. She could see the weight of everyday life lifting off his shoulders. James had been working long hours at a local nonprofit organization, dedicating himself to helping others. But lately, the stress had taken a toll on him, and he had been dreaming of a time when he could simply sit back and relax. This vacation was his chance to recharge, to finally unwind without the constant rush of emails and meetings. Their two children, Marcus and Layla, were just as eager. Marcus, their eldest at 13, had been counting down the days. He was the quiet, observant type, always looking out for his younger sister. Layla, at 9, was full of energy and excitement. She kept chattering about all the adventures they would have, building sand castles, swimming in the ocean, and, of course, collecting seashells. Both of them were looking forward to the freedom of a few days away from school and the pressures that came with it. Marie couldn't help but smile at their enthusiasm. She had spent so many years juggling work, family responsibilities, and keeping the house running smoothly. This vacation was her opportunity to slow down and savor the little moments with her family. For her, it wasn't about luxury, it was about time. Time to reconnect, to laugh, and to enjoy each other's company without distractions. As the car hit the road, the rhythmic sound of the tires on the pavement was comforting. James turned to Marie and spoke with a warmth that felt rare these days. "We needed this. Just a few days to breathe, right?" Marie nodded, her heart light. "Absolutely. We all need it." The kids were already asking how much longer, but the excitement in their voices didn't feel annoying. It felt like the start of something new. For James and Marie, this vacation wasn't just a break, it was a dream. A dream to spend uninterrupted time together as a family, away from the noise of the world. James looked out of the window, his mind wandering. He had always been a man of action, someone who fought for change, for equality. His work in the nonprofit sector had given him purpose, but it had also made him keenly aware of the challenges his family faced. There were times when he felt invisible, judged by the color of his skin rather than the worth of his efforts. But here, in this car, with his family beside him, he felt something else. Hope. The belief that this vacation would offer them more than just rest. It would give them a glimpse of peace, far away from the struggles they sometimes faced. As they neared their destination, the scenery changed. The road curved into a quiet coastal town, with beaches stretching for miles and tall palm trees lining the streets. The world outside looked perfect, a sharp contrast to the chaos they had left behind. The kids' excitement reached its peak as they approached the beach, eager to explore the new surroundings. But even in this peaceful place, James couldn't fully let go of the feeling that they would always be seen differently, that something as simple as a vacation might still be clouded by the weight of who they were. Still, for now, he pushed the thought aside. Today was for his family. Today was for them. As the Williams family drove deeper into the small beach town, The anticipation of the vacation ahead seemed to grow with every mile. The sun, now higher in the sky, bathed the streets in a warm golden hue, creating the perfect atmosphere for their long-awaited getaway. Laughter filled the car, Marcus and Layla playfully arguing over who would get the biggest slice of pizza later that night, while Marie and James exchanged amused glances in the front seat. Everything felt perfect, as if they had left all the stress behind them. But the moment the family turned onto a quieter street, their vacation took an unexpected turn. A police car, its siren flashing but lights muted, pulled in behind them, signaling for them to pull over. James's heart skipped a beat, the sudden shift from peaceful joy to uncertainty sending a chill down his spine. He slowed the car, pulling over to the side of the road, and glanced at Marie, who met his eyes with a quiet, worried look. They both knew what was happening. They had experienced moments like this before, when the world around them seemed to question their right to be somewhere, to just exist peacefully. The officer approached the car slowly, his boots thudding against the asphalt with deliberate force. He didn't smile, didn't even offer a polite greeting. Instead, his eyes locked onto James through the driver's side window with an intensity that felt cold and distant. The officer was tall, his uniform stiff and imposing, and the expression on his face was one that suggested suspicion before anything else. "Good afternoon." The cop's voice was sharp, almost dismissive. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" James, though his nerves were on edge, maintained his composure. "No, officer. Is everything all right?" The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced around, taking in the car, its worn seats, the kids in the back, the beach towels and cooler packed neatly beside them. There was nothing suspicious about them, nothing that would explain the officer's behavior. But that didn't matter. "I noticed you folks don't exactly look like you belong around here," the cop said, his words laced with a subtle, almost imperceptible disdain. James froze for a moment, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. He didn't know how to respond at first. Was this some sort of routine check? Or was the officer implying something deeper? Marie, sensing the shift in the air, shifted in her seat, her hand moving gently to James's arm. She knew this was one of those moments when staying calm was their only option. "We're here on vacation," James replied slowly, his voice steady but firm. "We just arrived and we're looking forward to some time by the beach." The officer didn't seem convinced. He peered inside the car, his eyes scanning every detail before his gaze returned to James. "Vacation, huh?" He raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "You folks come around these parts often?" "No, sir. First time," James answered, his voice carefully controlled. He had hoped that would settle the matter, but the officer's tone grew even more suspicious. "Uh-huh. And you're sure you're here for leisure, not, let's say, something else?" Something inside James tightened. The cop's words felt like a sharp jab, questioning not just their presence but their worth. As if, in his eyes, they didn't have the right to be here. Marie's heart sank as she watched her husband's face harden. She could feel the tension building in the air, and she hated how familiar this all felt. She could see Marcus and Layla in the rearview mirror, their faces tense and uncertain. They hadn't said a word, but she could tell they were scared. This wasn't the peaceful vacation they had imagined. The officer didn't give them a chance to speak further before he snapped, "I'm going to need to see everyone's IDs." There was a long silence as James hesitated for a moment. The request was completely unnecessary. He had already explained who they were, where they were from. But he knew better than to argue. Keeping things calm was the only way forward. He reached into his wallet and handed over his driver's license. Marie followed suit, passing over her ID without saying a word. But as the officer took their IDs, his gaze remained cold, his suspicion growing with every passing second. "You got a reason for coming to this town?" the officer asked again, his voice more aggressive this time. "You sure this is where you belong?" James's jaw clenched, but he held his ground. "Yes, officer. We're just here to enjoy a vacation. That's all." The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned and walked back to his car, holding their IDs in his hand. The Williams family sat in silence, the tension thick in the car. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting between his parents, clearly confused. Layla, who usually bubbled with excitement, was now eerily quiet. The weight of the moment was sinking in. The feeling of being judged, of being treated as if they didn't belong, was something they all knew too well. James exhaled slowly, trying to steady himself. It felt like an eternity before the officer returned, still holding their IDs. His expression hadn't changed, and his presence still felt like a looming threat. He handed the IDs back to James without a word, but his gaze remained cold. "I'll be checking with the local authorities. Stay put," he said curtly, before walking back to his police car without another glance. Inside the car, Marie didn't know what to say. They all sat there, trapped in the silence, unsure of what would happen next. The kids were visibly shaken, and James could feel the anger bubbling up inside him. He had done nothing wrong. They had done nothing wrong, and yet they were being treated like criminals for no reason other than who they were. The minutes stretched on. It felt like an eternity before the officer finally returned, this time with a slight shift in his demeanor. He handed James a small slip of paper, his tone less harsh but still suspicious. "You're free to go," the cop said, his words lacking any real warmth. "Just try to be more mindful of your presence around here." James clenched his fists, but didn't respond. He didn't trust his voice right now. He just wanted to get away from the officer, to get back to the peace they had hoped for. As the officer drove away, the weight of what had just happened settled heavily on their shoulders. Marie reached over, placing her hand gently on James's. Without a word, he started the car again, pulling back onto the road. The vacation they had dreamed of suddenly felt distant, like a dream slipping away, replaced by the bitter reality of what they had just experienced. As James drove away from the officer's presence, the weight of what had just happened lingered in the car. He kept his eyes on the road, trying to focus on getting to their destination, but his hands gripped the steering wheel tighter with each passing second. Marie remained silent, her gaze fixed out the window, lost in thought. The kids were quiet too, their faces etched with confusion and unease. James felt the tension building in the car. He could sense that something inside his family had shifted. They'd always been able to find joy in the simplest moments, like this vacation. But now, that sense of joy felt tainted. The cop's rude questioning had planted a seed of doubt in their minds, a seed that would take a long time to shake. "I'm sorry," James muttered, his voice thick with frustration. "I can't believe that just happened." Marie turned to him, her expression soft but resolute. She didn't say anything at first, but her eyes spoke volumes. She had felt it too, the injustice, the unfairness of the situation. They both had. This wasn't just about a rude cop. It was about something bigger, something that had followed them their entire lives. As they continued driving, a silence fell over the car again. The kids hadn't asked many questions yet. They were still trying to process what had happened. But Marie could tell they were scared. She could see it in the way Marcus's shoulders were hunched, his eyes darting around nervously. Layla, normally full of questions, was eerily quiet, her small hands clutching her backpack tightly. Marie leaned back, her mind racing. The officer hadn't known who they were, not really. He hadn't recognized the significance of the people he had just harassed. James's position at the nonprofit was well known in certain circles, even if the average person on the street wouldn't recognize his name. He had worked tirelessly for years, advocating for underprivileged communities and fighting for social justice. He wasn't just another man driving into a beach town. He was someone who had spoken at national conferences, someone who had changed lives. But none of that mattered to the cop. To him, James was just another black man driving through town. Marie's work was just as influential, though it took a different form. She had dedicated her life to activism, advocating for equality, equity, and opportunity for communities that were often overlooked. She had organized protests, fought against discriminatory policies, and worked with organizations that helped bring real change to struggling communities. Her name was well known in local circles, and she had been interviewed on several platforms for her contributions to social justice. But to the officer, she was just another woman in the backseat of a car, a woman whose presence was deemed suspicious simply because of her race. The family's lack of recognition in that moment wasn't a coincidence. It was a result of the officer's assumptions, his failure to see beyond his own biases. He had no idea that the people he had just harassed were far more than just a vacationing family, and as that truth settled in Marie's mind, she couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of irony. The man who had looked at them with such suspicion had no clue who he had crossed paths with. As the car continued down the road, the weight of it all seemed to hang in the air. It was like the family was suspended in time, driving through this idyllic town, but unable to shake the feeling of being unwelcome. Marie could feel the injustice rising in her chest, but she also knew there was nothing she could do in that moment. They had been forced to play the role of the good family, quiet, compliant, doing everything they could to avoid confrontation. But inside, the anger was building. The unfairness of it all gnawed at her. James reached out to take her hand, and she squeezed it back. They didn't need words to understand each other right now. This was a familiar feeling, one they had both experienced before, but that didn't make it any easier to bear. At that moment, Marcus spoke up, his voice small but shaky. "Dad, why did the cop act like that? We didn't do anything wrong." James's heart twisted. He hadn't wanted to have this conversation with Marcus yet. He had hoped to shield his children from the harsh realities of the world for just a little while longer. But he knew it wasn't something he could hide from them forever. "We didn't do anything wrong, Marcus," James said quietly. "But sometimes people judge us based on what they think they know, not on who we really are." "But why? Why did he keep asking you about where we were going? Like we didn't belong here," Marcus pressed, his confusion palpable. Marie turned around in her seat to face her son, her expression gentle but firm. "Because sometimes people make assumptions about us, about our lives, about who we are, just because of how we look." "But it's not fair," Layla piped up from the back seat, her voice quivering with frustration. "Why can't he just leave us alone?" Marie's heart broke for her children. They were too young to understand the complexities of racism, too innocent to grasp the weight of what had just happened. But in a way, their reactions made it even clearer that what they had experienced wasn't just an isolated event. It was part of a larger, deeply rooted issue that would follow them for the rest of their lives. "We know it's not fair, sweetheart," Marie said, her voice soft and comforting. "But we have to stay calm, okay? Sometimes we have to be better than the people who don't understand us." James nodded in agreement, his voice steady. "It's not easy, but we have to keep going, and we have to show them that we belong here just like anyone else." The kids were quiet after that, but there was a noticeable shift in their demeanor. They were still confused, still frightened by what had just happened, but they seemed to be absorbing the lesson their parents were trying to teach them. The truth was, they would have to learn how to handle these moments themselves one day. But for now, James and Marie would do everything they could to protect them from the weight of it. As the family continued their drive into town, the tension in the car didn't fully lift. The oppressive feeling of being watched, of being judged without reason, still hung in the air. But there was something else now, too. Something beneath the surface. The cop had no idea who they were. He had no idea what they had done for their community, for the people who needed their voices. He had no idea how many lives they had touched, how many barriers they had broken. And maybe that was for the best. Maybe, if he had known, he would have treated them differently. But it also made their mission clear. In a town that had so quickly dismissed them, James and Marie would continue to work, to fight for justice, and to show that they belonged here, no matter how many people failed to see it. James sat still behind the wheel, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. His heart was still racing from the encounter with the officer, but he knew this was far from over. His mind was already working, calculating the best way to turn the tables, to right the wrong that had just been done to his family. As the cop turned and walked back to his car, James's fingers subtly moved to his phone. The moment was tense, the weight of the situation pressing on him. He didn't want to escalate things. He knew that would only make matters worse for everyone. But he couldn't let this go. Not this time. Marie glanced at him, sensing what he was about to do. She didn't stop him. Instead, she offered a small, knowing nod. They both knew the importance of this decision. This wasn't just about them anymore. It was about standing up for what was right, for showing their children that they could fight back when things were unjust. James opened his contacts and quickly tapped on a name at the top of the list. He typed out a brief message, his thumb moving swiftly across the screen. "We just had an issue with an officer here. Please send someone, it's urgent." He hit send and then locked the phone, slipping it back into his pocket. The family sat in silence as the minutes passed, the tension in the air thick enough to feel. Marie could feel her pulse quicken as she waited, watching the officer lean against his patrol car in the rearview mirror, still unaware of the move they had just made. She glanced over at Marcus and Layla, both of whom were sitting quietly, their eyes wide with anxiety. They had never been in a situation like this before. No child should have to witness their parents being treated unfairly like this. She had done her best to reassure them, but there was a palpable sense of confusion in their eyes. It wasn't long before the sound of another car pulling up broke the silence. Marie's eyes widened in surprise as a black sedan parked behind the officer's patrol car. The officer didn't seem to notice it immediately, too focused on the family and the situation at hand. But when the new officer stepped out of the car, something changed. The senior officer wore a crisp uniform, a higher rank evident in the way he carried himself. His demeanor was different from the first officer, confident, composed. And as he approached the scene, he glanced at the patrol car before his eyes landed on James and Marie. The officer's recognition was immediate. His eyes widened slightly, and for the first time, James saw a shift in the senior officer's expression, a shift from business-like professionalism to something more familiar, something more respectful. "James Williams." The senior officer's voice was calm, but there was a tinge of surprise in his tone. James's heart skipped a beat. There it was. Recognition. The senior officer knew who he was. "Yes, that's me," James replied, his voice steady. He didn't miss the way the officer's expression changed, as if he were just realizing the weight of the situation. The first officer, who had been busy checking his equipment, looked up at the sound of his superior's voice. His face dropped when he saw who the man was speaking to. He didn't recognize James at first, but the moment he saw the senior officer's reaction, a wave of realization seemed to crash over him. The first officer straightened up, clearly caught off guard. The senior officer turned to him, his voice now sharp. "What's going on here? Why did you pull this family over?" The first officer stammered for a moment, his eyes darting between the senior officer and the Williams family. I was just doing a routine check, sir. Nothing serious." The senior officer raised an eyebrow, his gaze narrowing as he turned back to James and Marie. "Is that so?" James felt his anger bubbling up, but he kept it in check. He wasn't here to escalate things further. The senior officer had clearly recognized their influence, and now it seemed like the wheels were starting to turn. Yes, that's right, James said coolly, his tone even. But I don't think it was routine, officer. I've been questioned repeatedly, my IDs checked without cause, and assumptions were made about my family and me, simply because of the way we look. The senior officer's expression shifted again, this time to one of regret, though it didn't seem to be directed at James. He turned sharply to the first officer, his voice lowering but still firm. You don't just pull over families like this without a reason, especially when you don't have all the facts. Do you know who these people are? The first officer's eyes darted between the senior officer and the Williams family, the gravity of the situation finally dawning on him. He shook his head, unable to respond. The senior officer's gaze lingered on James for a moment before he took a breath, his face now filled with genuine remorse. Mr. Williams, I am so sorry for the inconvenience and discomfort caused. This should not have happened. There is no excuse for what just took place. He turned to Marie as well, offering an apologetic nod. I apologize to you, too. James's heart pounded in his chest, but he held his ground. This apology was important. It wasn't just for him, but for his family. For his children who had seen their parents humiliated for no reason. But he knew this apology didn't fix the damage. The tension in his shoulders didn't ease. It couldn't. Not yet. Thank you for the apology, James said, his voice steady but clipped. But this should never have happened in the first place. My family is just here to enjoy a vacation, and we deserve to be treated with respect. No one should have to explain themselves for simply existing in a place. The senior officer nodded, his face now serious. You're right. And I will make sure this matter is taken seriously. I will personally file a report about this incident. He paused, taking a long look at the first officer. You'll be held accountable for this mistake. The first officer stood silently, his face flushed with embarrassment, his gaze lowered. He had made a huge mistake, one that he couldn't undo no matter how much he wished he could. Thank you, James said, his voice steady now, though the weight of the situation still lingered. He didn't know what would happen to the officer, but that wasn't his concern right now. What mattered was that his family was treated with dignity. I appreciate you handling this. The senior officer nodded and turned to the first officer once more. You'll be hearing from Internal Affairs. For now, I suggest you go back to the station. Without another word, the first officer climbed back into his car, his face a mix of frustration and shame. He drove off without another glance at the family he had wronged. James turned to Marie, who was silently watching everything unfold. She nodded at him, and he could see the relief in her eyes. Their children, too, seemed to exhale collectively. Though the experience had shaken them, they now had a glimpse of what it meant to stand up for what was right. Let's go, kids, James said quietly, signaling for them to buckle up. The family didn't speak for a few moments, but the air in the car had shifted. The tension had dissipated, replaced with something quieter, something stronger. The family knew that they had just turned a corner, and that this moment of realization would change everything. For once, they had been seen for who they truly were, not as stereotypes, but as individuals. And in that brief moment, they had regained a bit of what had been taken from them. And that, for James and Marie, was enough for today. The days following the incident in the small beach town unfolded in ways the Williams family hadn't anticipated. The confrontation, initially a source of anger and frustration, quickly became a pivotal moment, not just for them, but for the community at large. Word spread fast, as it often does in tight-knit places, and before long, the story was making its rounds through local news outlets and social media platforms. As a well-known community activist and someone who had spent years advocating for equality, Marie had a significant presence in the social justice landscape. James, too, had made a name for himself working in high-level nonprofit circles, supporting initiatives that sought to bridge the gaps between marginalized communities and broader society. Though they had wanted a peaceful vacation, their identities, their experiences, and their voices were far too impactful for the events to go unnoticed. The local news picked up the story, and soon the story of a black family being harassed by a police officer, unaware of who they were, became a hot topic. It didn't take long before reporters were reaching out to both James and Marie for interviews. People who had known them only in passing were now coming forward to express their support, while others who had heard the story echoed their outrage. But it wasn't just local news that paid attention. The incident garnered national coverage. Some outlets called it an example of the everyday racism that people of color face, while others emphasized the dangerous consequences of unchecked prejudice within law enforcement. In the days that followed, people from all over the country began commenting, discussing, and debating the event. The officer who had initially stopped them was placed on administrative leave as an internal investigation was launched into the incident. It was clear now that his actions, although seemingly minor in his eyes, were a reflection of a deeper, more systemic issue. His ignorance of the Williams family's identity had cost him dearly. The story of his mistake had gone viral. He had, in essence, become a symbol of prejudice, not just in his actions, but in his failure to acknowledge the Williams family for who they were. In private moments, Marie and James spoke about what this meant for their children. Their kids had seen their parents humiliated that day, seen the way the officer had treated them as though they didn't belong in the very town they had come to visit. They had witnessed the assumptions made about their parents, simply based on their skin color. But now, in the aftermath, there was a growing sense of responsibility in James and Marie, not just to protect their children, but to use this moment for something bigger than themselves. While the public was consumed with debates about accountability, reform, and racism, the Williams family took a different route. They didn't seek revenge against the officer. Instead, they chose to use this painful experience as a platform for education, to raise awareness about racial discrimination and how easily prejudice can creep into everyday interactions. A few days after the incident, James sat down for an interview with a major news outlet. The interview was being broadcast live, and thousands of people tuned in to hear him speak about what had happened. "I didn't want this attention," James began, his voice calm but resolute. "All we wanted was to enjoy a simple vacation, to take a break from the work we do every day in fighting for justice. But what happened to us, what happened to my family, is something many black families experience, time and time again. It doesn't matter who we are, how much we've done for our communities, how much we've contributed to society. In the eyes of some, we are just a stereotype. We're just another black family who doesn't belong." He paused for a moment, his eyes locking with the camera. "What I want people to understand is the emotional toll this takes. The officer who pulled us over had no idea who we were. He didn't know that I've worked tirelessly for years to help underprivileged communities. He didn't know that my wife has been an advocate for social justice for decades. But the moment we were treated unfairly, he didn't need to know any of that. It didn't matter. Because to him, we were just another black family to question, to judge, to make feel like they didn't belong." The interview continued, but James's words had already resonated with millions of viewers. His voice was a quiet force, strong with the weight of truth and experience. He wasn't speaking just for his family. He was speaking for every person who had ever been made to feel less than, simply because of the color of their skin. Marie, too, took to social media and gave interviews, sharing her perspective as an activist. Her words were filled with a quiet strength as she spoke about the struggles that people of color face in everyday situations, whether it's being judged at the grocery store, ignored in a professional setting, or stopped by law enforcement without cause. "We don't want special treatment," she said in one interview. "We want equality. We want respect. And we want to see a world where our children don't have to grow up worrying about how they will be treated based on their race." In the coming weeks, The officer's actions became part of the ongoing conversation about racial discrimination in America. The police department faced pressure to address the systemic issues within its ranks. Calls for accountability and police reform grew louder, and the Williams family became unlikely figures in that movement. As for the officer, the public reaction was swift. While some defended his actions, arguing that he was just doing his job, others criticized him for allowing his biases to cloud his judgment. Many pointed out that his failure to recognize the Williams family's contributions to society and their right to simply exist without harassment was an example of how deeply ingrained racism could be, even in those who were supposed to protect and serve. The investigation into his conduct revealed a pattern of behavior that was less than exemplary. He was ultimately placed on indefinite leave, pending further investigation into his actions and the larger question of how such biases could have gone unchecked. The department in turn launched a series of training programs to address implicit bias and improve community relations. James and Marie never publicly sought retribution. They didn't want to punish the officer. What they wanted, what they had always wanted, was change. They wanted to spark conversations, to get people to think about their actions, to question their assumptions, and most importantly, to take responsibility for how they treated others. In their eyes, the real victory was the shift in awareness that had followed. They knew the work wasn't done, but they had, in some way, managed to turn a negative experience into something transformative. The public outcry and subsequent discussions about racial discrimination, though born from an ugly moment, had brought something important to the forefront. The need for empathy, understanding, and, above all, respect for the dignity of every human being, regardless of their background or skin color. For the Williams family, this wasn't the end of their fight. It was just another step in the long road toward justice. And while the scars of that day would linger, they knew that by sharing their story, they were helping to pave the way for a future where no one would have to endure such treatment ever again. The Williams family did eventually return to their vacation, though the days that followed were different from what they had imagined. What was meant to be a peaceful retreat had turned into something far more significant, an unexpected moment of reckoning for them, their community, and beyond. The calm, sandy beaches and gentle waves that had initially promised a quiet escape now seemed almost surreal in contrast to the weight of what had happened. But despite everything, they carried on, their spirits unbroken. Marcus and Layla had watched their parents handle the situation with a quiet strength, and they were beginning to understand what it meant to stand up for what was right, even when it felt difficult or uncomfortable. As they sat together on the beach, their parents' words echoed in their minds. "We have to show them that we belong here just like anyone else." The kids were still processing the events of the past week, but they were proud of their mother and father for facing the injustice with dignity, for turning an ugly experience into a teaching moment. Marcus, normally reserved, had even shared with his mom how inspired he was by the way his father had handled the situation. Layla, her eyes wide with understanding, had asked questions about why such things happened and what they could do to help others. James and Marie shared a quiet look between them. They knew their children were learning an important lesson, one they hoped would stick with them for the rest of their lives. In the end, their experience wasn't just about them. It was about the broader conversation they had sparked, the ripple effect their actions had created. People from all walks of life, families, activists, even those who had previously been indifferent, were talking about what had happened. The incident had made people reflect on the biases they carried with them, the assumptions they unknowingly made, and the ways in which prejudice still shaped so many lives. And slowly, the Williams family's story began to shift the narrative. By refusing to let this moment define them, by using their platform to bring awareness rather than seek retribution, they had started a conversation that extended far beyond their vacation. People were listening now, understanding that racism wasn't just something that happened in faraway places. It was happening everywhere. The community where the family had vacationed, once a place of confusion and unease for the Williams, began to change. The conversations in town started to take on a different tone. People questioned their assumptions, examined their prejudices, and slowly, one conversation at a time, minds began to shift. It was clear that the family's actions had opened doors for greater empathy and understanding. And though the journey ahead was still long, there was hope. Hope that things could change, even if it started with small steps. The Williams family had shown that, through resilience and grace, one family could indeed make a difference. By standing up for themselves, they had unknowingly inspired others to stand up too. They had reminded people that racism affects everyone, but through unity, understanding, and standing up for what's right, change is possible. The sun began to set on the beach, casting a warm glow over the water. The family sat together in silence for a moment, feeling the weight of the day's lessons, yet finding peace in knowing they had done the right thing. James placed an arm around Marie, his voice soft but filled with certainty. "This is just the beginning," he said. "We've sparked something bigger than us, and that's what matters." Marie nodded, a smile tugging at her lips as she looked at their children, who were laughing and playing in the sand, still innocent, still hopeful. Yes, there was hope. And it was in moments like this, the quiet, unspoken resilience of a family, that real change would begin.